Hi, you guys. Welcome back to part 3 of the 1960s. And so we left off talking about really the rise of different movements in the 1960s. We see the Black Power movement that will come up in the 1960s, as well as different activists. We have the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, who will stand in for at least for a time in direct opposition to Martin Luther King. He doesn't believe in nonviolent protests. He doesn't believe in integration. He is a critic of integration. He believes that Black people should have their own economic resources. So now we will turn to Vietnam, which also occurs in the 1960s. I always say an entire course could be taught on the 1960s, right? So let's start on here, Vietnam and the New Left. So few Americans had any knowledge of Vietnam or Vietnam's history, their culture. Many Americans maybe could they find it on a map? Who knows? The South Vietnamese leader, Diem, lost control of the countryside to the communist-led Viet Cong, okay? And remember, during this time, the U.S. is focused on defeating communism, on fighting communism, okay? Now, the U.S. supported a military coup that led to Diem's death. Now, while he was alive, he questioned the wisdom of Vietnam, but he didn't take any action to end American presence in Vietnam. And so Vietnam becomes known as Lyndon Johnson's War. So we have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which occurs in August of 1964. This is very significant. This will more than likely be on a test. You may have an essay on it, so please read more. You should be reading your chapters anyways, but please read more about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident happens in August of 1964. So allegedly, and that is very important, allegedly, North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly fired on an American vessel. According to Daniel Ellsberg, which you'll learn more about in the next chapter with the Pentagon Papers, it became clear within days that this did not happen. However, having this incident allowed Lyndon Johnson to escalate the war. And so out of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, we get the Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel an armed attack in Vietnam. So let's remember, the Gulf of Tonkin incident allegedly Vietnamese patrol boats had fired on American vessels. But within days, it became known that this didn't really happen. But what it allowed was for Lyndon Johnson to really create wider war. Okay, it allowed him to escalate the war. Now, Johnson says he has no intentions of sending troops to Vietnam. This is what he says. However, by 1968, we have more than 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. American planes will drop more bombs on Vietnam than both sides used in World War II. Okay, American planes will drop more bombs on Vietnam than both sides used in World War II. Now, once the war starts, there is a huge anti-war movement. There was opposition. Opposition to the war will unite people. Opposition to the war will unite lots of organizations. Now, college students are exempt from the draft. They are exempted from the draft, meaning that they do not have to fight. They will not be drafted if you are in college. However, because of this, the burden of fighting fell on the working class and the poor. And so that is another aspect of protest for the Vietnam War, that you have the poorest among us, the people who are struggling the most, who are now having to fight in this war. So that will be another area of protest. You also get the counterculture out of this, which has really a rallying cry of liberation and cultural freedom. Youth at this time will revolt against the values and the behaviors of their elders. And you start to see a rejection in norms and clothing and language and sexual behavior and drug use. So you start to see the counterculture or hippies evolve or come. You start to see hippies kind of come up in the 1960s as well. Some of us think of this as being in the 1970s, but it starts in the 1960s because it is a way of protesting. They are saying we are liberated. We want liberation. We want freedom, and not just for ourselves, for all people. Okay? It's not just young people who are getting their liberation. Women are also experiencing a liberation movement of themselves. During this time, the women's liberation movement will focus on equal opportunities for women in jobs, in education, and in political participation. You start to see the rise of a new feminism. The Feminine Mystique was written in 1963 by Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan was the first president of the National Organization for Women, or NOW. So you start to see the rise of a new feminism. You start to see the rise of this women's liberation movement, which will again demand equal opportunities in jobs, equal pay for women, which is something that we are still fighting for, equal pay for equal work. They're fighting for equal opportunities in education, as well as equal opportunities in political participation. And so we start to see this rights revolution in the late 1950s and the 1960s. So I'm going to go over some court cases, and one of these cases we'll be going over in next chapter as we talk more about Vietnam and such. So NAACP versus Alabama was in 1958. NAACP versus Alabama was in 1958. And this struck down Southern laws that forced organizations to make their membership lists public, okay? That struck down Southern laws that forced organizations to make their membership lists public. New York Times versus Sullivan was in 1964, and what this did was overturn a libel judgment against the New York Times newspaper for carrying advertisements that were critical of how local officials treated civil rights demonstrators. And Loving versus Virginia, we see this one, Loving versus Virginia in 1967 was Loving versus Virginia, and it declared laws prohibiting interracial marriage unconstitutional, okay? And that wasn't until 1967. We also see some laws involving the states and policing the states. We get Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, which stated that an individual in police custody must be informed of their rights to remain silent and to confer with an attorney before answering questions. And they must be told that any statements might be used against them in court. So I am a fan of Law and Order SVU. And so they always, whenever they arrest someone, they always have to give them their Miranda warning. Okay, so if you are arrested, hopefully you never are, but if you are arrested, the police officer has to tell you that A, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to not say anything. Okay, that if you do say something, it can be used against you in court. You also, in this Miranda warning, it says you have the right to speak with an attorney, and that if you cannot afford an attorney will be essentially given to you. Okay, that is your Miranda rights. And in 1966, in Miranda versus Arizona, it said that individuals in police custody have to be aware of their rights to not say a thing, to that they get an attorney, and that anything they say can be used against them in court. Okay. And in 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut, again, 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut overturned a state law that prohibited the use of contraceptives. Okay. So now we get to 1968, and this is where we will end the chapter, and we will again start the 1970s and next chapter. But in 1968 is a year of turmoil. An entire course could probably be taught on the year 1968 alone. In late January, the Tet Offensive is launched in Vietnam. Lyndon B. Johnson also announces in 1968 that he would not run for re-election. Peace talks about the war will begin soon. However, the Vietnam War will not end until the mid-70s. It will not end until 1965, which is why in the next chapter we'll be talking about Vietnam as well, okay? Also in 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th. He is assassinated at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968 on April 4th, okay? So that is the end of the chapter. I will check you next time for History Tea with Professor T. Again, I'm Professor T, and I hope you enjoyed this video. All right, thanks.